the discovery that changed everything in Carroll County, Arkansas, wasn't made by a lawman or a historian. It was made by a 12-year-old boy named Ezra Pickett in the spring of 1886, 16 years after the events that would come to haunt the Ozarks. Ezra had been sent to the root cellar of the old Pickett homestead to bring up a jar of preserved peaches for his mother. The cellar was dark and damp, smelling of earth and decay, and his groping hand encountered something that was not a jar. It was a metal box, rusted and heavy, tucked behind a stack of rotting potato crates. He dragged it into the light of the kitchen, and his mother, Sarah, used a kitchen knife to pry open the corroded lid. Inside were not valuables, but a collection of papers, crumbling with age, a ledger book, several letters tied with a faded ribbon, and a small leather journal. The ledger was not about crops or livestock. It listed names, dates, and monetary amounts. The letters were desperate, pleading. The journal was a first-person account of a nightmare. For 16 years, the truth of what happened in the autumn of 1870 had been buried in that cellar, hidden by the very people who had lived through it. The box held the secret of the Carroll County Tragedy, a story that had been whispered about for a generation but never fully understood. A story of a doctor, a fire, a murder, and a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the new state government. To understand what was in that box, we must first understand the world that created it. Carroll County in 1870 was a place of raw beauty and raw terror. Nestled in the Ozark Mountains of northwestern Arkansas, the county was a patchwork of deep hollows, swift-running creeks, and steep, forested ridges. The Civil War had only been over for 5 years, and the scars of that conflict ran deep. Arkansas had been a battleground, with neighbor fighting neighbor in a brutal guerrilla war that had left the state devastated. When we think of the Civil War, we often think of grand armies clashing at places like Gettysburg. But in the Ozarks, the war was a dirty, personal affair of bushwhackers and jayhawkers, irregular fighters on both sides who used the war as an excuse for murder, robbery, and settling old scores. The war had left a vacuum of law, a culture of violence, and a deep-seated distrust of authority that would define the Reconstruction era in this part of the country. Men had gotten used to solving their problems with guns and ambushes. This was not a place for the faint of heart. The official records reflect this period of chaos and transition. Carroll County had been established in 1833, named for Charles Carroll, the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence. Its two county seats, Berryville and Eureka Springs, represented the east and west parts of the sprawling county. But in December 1869, disaster struck. A courthouse fire in Berryville destroyed all of the county's courthouse records dated up to that time. It was a catastrophic loss. Property deeds, court cases, marriage licenses, all turned to ash. The fire of 1869 is a footnote in historical archives now, but for the people living at the time, it was an opportunity for chaos. With the official record of land ownership and legal agreements destroyed, the door was open for fraud, theft, and the settling of old scores under the cover of "I lost my deed in the fire." It was in this environment, in the shadow of that fire, that the tragedy of 1870 began to unfold. Then, just a year later, a second fire struck the courthouse in 1870. 2 fires in 2 years. Officials would later claim it was an accident, a faulty chimney, or a carelessly discarded lantern. But to the residents of the county, it was something more sinister. It was a deliberate attempt to erase history. To erase the truth. It was into this environment of fire and fear that our protagonist stepped. His name was Dr. Elias Rector Duval, and his story, while brilliantly successful in many ways, is forever intertwined with the tragedy of Carroll County. Born in Fort Smith in 1836, Duval was the son of a prominent trading family. He was a man of education and ambition, graduating from Arkansas College in Fayetteville and then attending the Louisville Medical School in Kentucky. He furthered his education at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School in Philadelphia, one of the finest medical institutions in the country. He was a U.S. Army surgeon in New Mexico Territory before the war, and when the Civil War broke out, he served as a Confederate surgeon, seeing action at the Battle of Prairie Grove. He was a man of science in a land of violence. In 1870, the same year of the second courthouse fire, Dr. Duval was at a turning point. He had returned to Fort Smith and resumed his practice. He was a leader in the effort to modernize medicine in the state, co-founding the Arkansas State Medical Association. He was a man on the rise. But it was not just his medical skills that defined him. Dr. Duval was a man with deep ties to the power structures of the region. His sister, Catherine, had married Elias Rector, who was a United States Marshal for the Western District of Arkansas and Indian Territory. This connection to the law, to the federal government, and to the enforcement of justice on the frontier would prove to be both an asset and a burden in the events that were about to unfold. The tragedy in Carroll County did not happen in isolation. It happened in a region where the law was a fragile concept, especially when it came to the treatment of the area's most vulnerable population, the newly freed African Americans. The 1870 census shows a population of 5,780 people in Carroll County, a steep decline from the 9,383 recorded in 1860. The war had taken its toll. But among those who remained were the black families who had been freed from slavery and were trying to build a new life in the hills. The federal government had established the Freedmen's Bureau to help them, but the reach of the Bureau was limited. In the remote hollows of the Ozarks, justice was often what the white community said it was. A chilling example of this justice occurred just across the state in Cross County, Arkansas, in August 1871. A 12-year-old white girl named Isy Sanders was found murdered. A black farm laborer named Frank Harris was suspected. In a terrifying parallel to the story we are telling, a mob of between 400 and 500 citizens took Harris from a court and lynched him, hanging him from a tree at the scene of the crime. The Arkansas Gazette expressed regret that the citizens had resorted to lynch law, but noted that they did not wonder, given the appalling character of the crime. This was the world Dr. Duval lived in. It was a world of assumed guilt, of swift and brutal justice, and of a legal system that was all too often a formality before the lynching. But our story begins not with a lynching, but with a murder. The murder of a white man, a doctor, in the remote hills of Carroll County. The identity of this man has been lost to time, but the accounts are clear. Sometime in the late summer or early autumn of 1870, a doctor, a healer, a man who had taken an oath to save lives, was found dead in the backcountry near the border of what was then the Cherokee Nation. The circumstances were suspicious. The man had been on his way to visit patients in the isolated settlements that dotted the mountains. His horse was found wandering, spooked, with his saddlebags still attached. His body was discovered a short distance away, in a shallow ravine. He had been shot in the back. The murder of a doctor in a remote area would have been shocking enough. But the identity of the suspect made it more shocking. The man who had been seen with him last, who had been his guide through the treacherous mountain paths, was a Cherokee man named John Ridge. The doctor's death was a tragedy. But it was about to become a powder keg. At the time of the murder, the region was a jurisdictional nightmare. The Carroll County Sheriff had no authority in the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee courts had no jurisdiction over a white man who committed a crime in their territory. It was a legal no man's land. Only the United States federal courts had the power to act. Specifically, the United States Court for the Western District of Arkansas, headquartered in Fort Smith. This court was unique in the American judicial system. It had jurisdiction over an area of over 70,000 square miles, stretching from Arkansas into the vast expanse of the Indian Territory. It was the sole law in a land of outlaws. The judge presiding over this court was a man who would become a legend of the American West, Judge Isaac Charles Parker, the hanging judge. But in 1870, Parker was not yet on the bench. He was still a rising politician in Missouri. The judge at the time was a man named William Story, who was already struggling to manage the colossal caseload of a district that was a haven for criminals. The court was one of the most expensive and busiest in the nation. In 1877, Parker's district terminated 154 criminal cases. Just a few years later, that number would explode to over 700. The number of cases alone is staggering, but the nature of them was what defined the era. The court was drowning in cases of larceny, assault, murder, and introducing liquor into the Indian country, a crime that made up a huge portion of the docket. In 1888 alone, 552 criminal cases were disposed of, with 32 for murder. It was a court of last resort for a lawless land. It was to this court that Dr. Duval looked for justice for his murdered colleague. He was, after all, not just a doctor, but a man of the law, deeply connected to the federal apparatus. He knew that the sheriff of Carroll County couldn't bring a Cherokee man to justice. Only a U.S. deputy marshal could. Dr. Duval called in a favor, tapping into his powerful family network. His brother-in-law, Elias Rector, was the U.S. Marshal for the Western District of Arkansas. Dr. Duval petitioned Marshal Rector to send a deputy marshal to Carroll County to investigate the murder and to bring John Ridge, the Cherokee suspect, back to Fort Smith to stand trial. This was the beginning of the investigation that would unravel the county. The deputy marshal who arrived in Carroll County was a man named Wallace. He was a hardened veteran of the frontier, a man who had tracked killers and horse thieves through the mountains and across the plains. He set up his command in the county seat of Berryville and began the difficult task of gathering evidence. The case was difficult, but the evidence seemed to point to John Ridge. The doctor had been seen with him. A witness had heard them arguing. And the man who had led the doctor into the hills had disappeared into the Cherokee Nation. But as Marshal Wallace began his investigation, he started to hear other things. Whispers. Stories. He was told that the doctor's murder was not what it seemed. That it wasn't a simple robbery or a dispute between a white man and an Indian. He was told that a group of white men in Carroll County had been meeting in secret. They called themselves regulators, vigilantes who took the law into their own hands, believing that the official courts were too slow and too lenient. They were, in effect, an early iteration of the bald knobbers that would terrorize the Ozarks a decade later. These men had a list. It was a list of people who they believed were trouble. It included white men who were sympathizing with the black community, it included carpetbaggers from the North who were trying to exploit the chaos of Reconstruction, and it included any Native American who was deemed to be a threat to white supremacy. And one of the names on their list was the doctor. He was a healer, but he was also a government man, a northerner in the eyes of these men, a man who had been seen treating black patients, giving them the same care he gave to white settlers. The doctor had been seen as a symbol of the new order, the hated Reconstruction. The men of the Ozarks had fought a war to preserve their way of life. They had lost. Now, a government-appointed doctor was coming to their homes, treating their people, and, worst of all, telling them they were wrong. The doctor was not just a healer. He was a threat. Marshal Wallace didn't want to believe it. He had come to arrest a Cherokee. But the evidence, the whispers, started to take shape. He was told that the murder of the doctor was a message. A warning to anyone else who might try to bring the federal government's new order to the Ozarks. The vigilantes had seen the doctor's presence as an invasion. They had made a decision to send a message. The motive for the murder was not a personal dispute over a woman or a horse. It was political. It was a targeted assassination. The murder of a federal official, an act of terror against the government of the United States. This revelation was a turning point. It was no longer a murder. It was a conspiracy. It was in the midst of this investigation, just as Dr. Duval was beginning to realize that he was dealing with more than a simple murder, that something terrible happened. A fire. A fire that was first noticed just after midnight. The fire that would consume what was left of the courthouse. There were witnesses. A man on the road from Berryville to Green Forest saw a group of 4 men riding fast away from the town in the direction of the Cherokee Nation. They were heading for the place that was a sanctuary for outlaws, a land beyond the reach of the Arkansas sheriff, the Indian Territory. An investigation into the blaze revealed it was no accident. The coals of the fire were too hot, the burn pattern too concentrated. The fire had been set. And when the investigators sifted through the ashes of the courthouse, they looked for the evidence that Marshal Wallace had gathered. The witness statements. The depositions. The report that Dr. Duval had helped to compile. All gone. Destroyed. The fire of 1870 had erased the official record of the murder investigation. The conspiracy was now a cover-up. The trail to John Ridge was cold. And the guns of the vigilantes remained smoking. Dr. Duvall was a man of science and logic. He had spent his career fighting for progress, for the creation of a state board of health, for the regulation of drugs, for the modernization of his beloved Arkansas. But this was something else. He knew that without the records, without the testimony, the case against the vigilantes was impossible. He also knew that the rumor of his fight for justice was spreading through the county. He was no longer the successful doctor in Fort Smith. He was a man with a target on his back. The conspiracy, the secrets, the violence, it was all closing in. And then came the final, devastating blow. Word reached Fort Smith that Marshal Wallace had been killed. He was found on the trail not far from the burned courthouse, his body riddled with bullets. The man sent to arrest John Ridge was dead. The man who believed Dr. Duvall's story was silenced. Now, only Dr. Duvall was left. He was the last person who knew the full scope of the conspiracy, the murder of the doctor, the destruction of the evidence, the silencing of the law. He had brought the U.S. government into Carroll County, and the U.S. government had been burned to the ground. He had called for federal help, and now a federal marshal was dead. Dr. Duvall had no choice but to go into hiding, fearing for his own life. He had come face to face with a hidden conspiracy, and it had nearly cost him everything. The murders of the doctor and the marshal, the courthouse fire, the missing evidence, it all connected. It was a desperate attempt by powerful men to protect themselves and their way of life. This was not a random act of frontier violence. It was an act of resistance against the new order of the nation. The law of the United States had come to the Ozarks, and the Ozarks had pushed back. The loss of the courthouse records in 1870 created a vacuum of legal memory. The identity of John Ridge, the man accused of the initial murder, became a ghost in the historical record. But the box in the cellar did more than just tell a story. It provided a name, an identity, and a fate. There, tied with a fading ribbon, was a collection of letters. They were written in a desperate, frantic hand. The first was from a doctor, the victim, writing to his family before his death. "I am treating the people here, both white and colored. The white men of this county do not look kindly upon this. They have told me to leave. I fear they will make good on their threats." The second letter was from Marshal Wallace to Dr. Duvall. "I have been following a group of men. They are the regulators. They have a list. Your friend's name is on it, and they are hunting him. He is no longer safe. I have secured the evidence in the courthouse. But I fear the men we are tracking have friends in high places." The third letter was from a frightened deputy, writing to his wife in Fort Smith. "The courthouse is gone. The paper I was guarding is gone. Wallace is dead. I am hiding in the cellar of a friend's home. They will kill me if they find me." It was a record of a crime, a confession of a conspiracy, and a testament to the fear that gripped the people of that county. The box also contained a final clue, a single photograph. It was a faded daguerreotype, a portrait of a Native American man with a stern, intelligent face. He was handsome, with a traditional long braid and dark eyes that seemed to look right through the viewer. On the back, in faded ink, was a single word, Ridge. The photograph was the final piece of the puzzle. It connected the Cherokee man to the doctor, to the marshal, and to the fire. It showed the face of the man who had been made the scapegoat for the murder. The man who Dr. Duvall had tried to save. The man who had died a fugitive. The man whose name had been erased from history. The box from the cellar contained the truth, the conspiracy, the murder, the cover-up, and the identity of the man who had been the target of a terrible injustice. But why had the family hidden it? Why had Ezra's mother, Sarah, kept the metal box a secret for 16 years? The letters provided the answer. In a final, heartbreaking letter, the deputy who had hidden in the cellar wrote to his wife, "They have found me. They are coming for me. I am leaving this box with a friend. Tell my children the truth. Tell them I died trying to do what was right. The men who did this are powerful. They are the law in this county. They will stop at nothing. But the truth will not stay hidden forever." Dr. Duvall survived the events of 1870, emerging as a major figure in Arkansas medicine. He became the president of the Arkansas State Medical Association in 1874 and co-founded the Arkansas Medical Society in 1875. He advocated for a state board of health, compulsory vaccination, and modern medical practices until his death in 1885. He is remembered as a giant of medicine, a man who helped to bring Arkansas into the modern world. But the mystery of Carroll County haunted him. He was never able to bring the guilty men to justice, and he never spoke publicly of the events of 1870 again. The story is a dark reflection of the period of Reconstruction. The lost cause of the Confederacy was not just a military defeat. It was a failure to reimagine a society built on equality. The question of what to do with a society built on slavery was the central question of the era. It was a question that was answered by terror and violence, by fire and by murder. The box in the cellar was the truth. But the truth was not enough to save the people who had been killed. It was not enough to bring justice to the men who had orchestrated the tragedy. It was simply the only record left of a crime that had been intended to be forgotten. The record of the conspiracy was hidden, not in a courthouse, but in a root cellar, waiting for a boy's hand to find it. The story is a reminder that some crimes are so terrible they are erased from the official record, but they can never be erased from history. The official story of Carroll County says that the fires were an accident and the murders were the result of frontier violence. But the box in the cellar told a different story. It told a story of a conspiracy, a cover-up, and a tragedy that took the lives of 4 men. The box was a record of a crime. But it was more than that. It was a testament to the courage of the people who tried to fight the injustice. It was a testament to the resilience of the people who survived. And it was a testament to the fact that truth, even when it is buried, will eventually be found. The legacy of the tragedy of 1870 is a reminder that the American story is not always a story of progress. It is a story of struggle, of loss, and of the people who fought to make it better. It is a story of the Carroll County tragedy, and the secrets that were kept for too long. It is the story of the hidden box in the cellar, and the truth it finally revealed. So, who were these regulators? Who were the men who burned the courthouse and shot down a federal marshal? The box provided names, but the records they burned made them ghosts, powerful and untouchable. It was a pattern that repeated itself across the South: lawless men enforcing a code of terror, answering to no one, and disappearing into the shadows of history. Their legacy was not just the graves of their victims, but an entire worldview built on fear, violence, and secrets. It is a worldview we still grapple with today. The scars of that era, the open wounds of injustice, have not fully healed. The shadows of the past are long, and they reach into our present, reminding us of the work still to be done. The story that unfolded from the box in the cellar is a story of one man, a doctor, a healer, a man of science, who came face to face with the darkest forces of his time and was nearly destroyed by them. It is the story of an entire generation grappling with the meaning of freedom and justice in a land torn apart by war. It is a story of a conspiracy that was designed to be forgotten, and of a truth that was finally, and with great difficulty, brought to light. It is the story of a county, a state, and a nation, still trying to come to terms with the ghosts of its past. And we are left with one final, haunting question: if the truth of the Carroll County tragedy could be hidden for 16 years in a root cellar, what other truths are still waiting to be found, hidden in the shadows of our forgotten history?